Welcome to the second of our tricky topics conversations with the Climate Resilience and Stewardship subgroup of the Oregon Community Food Systems Network. Great to see you all here today. Hope you're doing well. Enjoying some maybe a little bit of cloudy weather. At least we are here in the valley. I think we'll just jump right in, and I'll give it over to our chair, Megan, to do a little introduction on what we've got planned and what we're doing here today. And then I'll introduce our presenters, and we'll get right into learning from these wonderful experts who are willing to take their time and share their expertise on Western water law with us. So.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So this is an event hosted by Oregon Community Food Systems Network, Farming for the Future work group, and there's a subgroup of that work group which is focused on climate resilience and stewardship. And we have been working through different projects and shared efforts, but realized that we wanted to spend some time diving into some tricky topics. There are some areas related to climate change and agriculture that are not simple. There's controversy around some of these issues, and we thought it would be educational and valuable for OCFSN members to have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about some of those issues, so you can decide as an organization both where you land, what you think, and what you want to do about it, how you want to get engaged in making change. So we're making space for that conversation today. We had a conversation a couple of months ago focused on carbon sequestration and climate change, where there is not full agreement among the scientific community about the potential for climate mitigation related to carbon sequestration. And so this is just another topic that it's really important one. It's come up a lot in OCFSN in our members' work and in our work together. And Andrew, maybe you could frame the conversation for us, since I don't have all that context.
Yeah. So we've done a little bit of this before. When I first started, we did our first regional convening in Bend, Oregon, and we had Lisa join us from the Deschutes River Conservancy, and we had Natalie provide an excellent overview. Natalie, who's with us today with Friends of Family Farmers, do an excellent overview of some of the topics of Western water law. And then in February of this year, we held our as the Farming for the Future working group, our first working group convening. And Megan led a group of folks in kind of brainstorming topics for these tricky topics conversations, and water law was the second in that ranking. So here we are at our second presentation. The carbon sequestration was number one, and now water. And obviously this is a huge topic that impacts all of the folks that we work with, all the producers, the communities that we work with around community food systems. Water is deeply connected to food systems production, and then also connects our food systems to the broader natural world. So we are deeply grateful for Caylin Barter with the Wild Salmon Center and Lisa Sales with the Deschutes River Conservancy to be here today to, like I said, share their expertise on this topic. And they're gonna give us a little bit of a 101. This is being recorded for folks who aren't able to attend. It's summertime. Folks are off doing gallivanting around, so we've got a recording for folks, but they're going to do a 101, and then they're going to provide some case studies on some specific examples that make community food systems potentially more resilient to climate change and how that relates to water. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So have your tough questions ready to grill Lisa and Caylin. And I just want to say we're just really thankful for them being here and helping us kind of bridge some of these gaps between food systems, conservation, these different places where folks are working. It's all interconnected, and it's great to learn from each other. So here to also build relationships across these different spaces. So, and that's something that Caylin and Lisa have been great about. So I'll let them take it away if that feels like a good enough intro.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Megan and Andrew. Lisa, I'm going to put you on the spot for a quick who you are and what you do, and then if you can hand it back to me and I'll jump right in.
Certainly, yeah. So I'm Lisa Seals, and I'm a programs manager at the Deschutes River Conservancy. I've been working with the DRC in one capacity or another for about 3.5 years, but I have been working in the water space in the Deschutes Basin for, oh gosh, going on like 13 years now. So yeah, so that, and I, as a programs manager, I run the DRC's on-farm program, which is essentially helping upgrade infrastructure both on the farm and irrigation district infrastructure to save water. I also work with the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative, which you're going to hear more about this afternoon. It's a stakeholder group of 46 different stakeholders writing a management plan for the basin. And I do a lot of outreach and communication for the DRC and a few other things related to our water banking. So yeah, kind of working on all the program spaces and really happy to be here with you all and talk about this very important topic.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll carry it forward. I'm Caylin Barter. I lead the Oregon Water Policy Program here at the Wild Salmon Center. We're based in Portland and we work across the whole North Pacific wherever there's wild salmon. So I am a water lawyer by training. I spent a few years running the stream flow restoration program at the Freshwater Trust, working with farmers and ranchers on voluntary water rights transactions that would help to improve farms' bottom lines and streams flow. And then I went into private practice for several years, representing farmers and ranchers in irrigation districts on water rights issues, often involving the Water Resources Department, and then had the opportunity to start a water policy program at Wild Salmon Center, which is where I've been for the last 3 years. It is so great to be in this space with all of you. We have a lot to cover. We have way too many slides, so we're going to sprint through them, but please do write down your questions so that we can get to them at the end. Your stories and your relationship to water is the key part that we're going to be like honing in on at the end. So think about how all these things maybe relate to you and relate to the members that you work with. With that, I am now going to attempt to share screen. And then move it to a place where you can see me. And I'm not looking off to the side. Okay, can everyone see my screen? All right, thumbs up from Andrew. Okay, here we go. Launching in. So water law and water rights. I told you I'm a water lawyer, but I'm going to try and make this fun and exciting. And I also have to beg your pardon because some of it is wonky and weird. But the goal here is so that you can at least have like some fundamental understanding of this weird wonky water world to be able to, like, your antenna can tingle when you're hearing something and you can be like, oh, this had to do with such and such issue and I know where I can start. And knowing is half the battle. All right, so United States of America. You can see this is a average annual precipitation. And you can see there's this like white band in the middle where things go from nice and green to hot, dry colors. And so this explains two different fundamental ways of how we manage the right to use water in the United States. On that nice green eastern half, they use a system that's called the riparian doctrine. That's where basically if there's water flowing past your property and you can use it, then you can. You just can't like use all of it. You still have to preserve some of that use for the other people who rely on that waterway. When you start to move west of that white bar in the middle, then we use what's called the prior appropriation system. And this explains why if you have a plot of property and there's a river or an irrigation ditch that flows by it, you don't have any right to tap into that water to use it. You have to first apply to get a water right in order to be able to access that water. And that's because there's not as much water falling out of the sky in the West as there is in the East. All of the water in the state belongs to all of us. this is a piece that gets forgotten a lot. So I just want to like drive this home, is all of the water in the state belongs to all of us from all water supply. However, there are rights to use it. And right now, there have been too many rights that have given out. And I meant to put this slide later on in the presentation, but what I'm going to crack into here is that most of the places across the state of Oregon already have granted way too many water rights for the amount of water supply that's there. And so if you're needing a new water right to support some use that you have on your property, chances are you're not going to be able to apply for a new one unless it's winter time. It's referred to as over appropriation. So more rights to use the water have been given out than water exists to satisfy those rights. How did we get here? Well, the whole system in the Western United States was built to support rapid development. Another word that you might appropriately use would be colonization. There was this sense of manifest destiny that the United States was going to push westward come hell or high water. And so they reappropriated a system that was developed during the gold rush era for how you would claim the rights to mine a particular piece of land. You would show up, you'd start digging, you'd post a notice on a nearby tree or stick that says, this is my mining claim. And then you had to keep working that mining claim. And if you didn't work it for a period of years, then it would revert back so that someone else could come and start working that mining claim. Well, they were like, oh, this seems to be working fine for mining. Let's use the same system for water, which is kind of problematic from the beginning, because as you can guess, rock has different characteristics than water. One being like, you can go a day without drinking rock. Rock won't get up and move if you're not paying attention to it. Everything needs water. So I'm just highlighting this, and I'm being a little bit silly about it, but it explains why our water system is so screwed up today. Is that we used this system to appropriate it that was built on an idea of conquering and of reclaiming. You know, there's all this wasteland. What are we going to do? We're going to put water on it, and we're going to make it support, you know, useful things. So that was the method from the 1840s all the way up to 1909. In 1909, the legislature passed the Water Code. And really all that changed in 1909 was that instead of posting something to a tree, you then had to apply for a permit to the newly born Water Resources Department. Fast forward 50 years after that, and you finally apply the same system to groundwater. So all the way from when, you know, people started settling the area from the east in the 1840s all the way up to the 1950s, if you could catch groundwater, you could use as much of it as you wanted to. Finally, in 1955, we brought that water rights permitting system to groundwater, but still granted way too much of it. And then finally in 1987 was the first time that there was a recognition that water in a river or a stream actually had some benefit, and maybe you could protect it there. This was a great image that Lisa added that I had never seen before. And these are two examples. On the right hand is this great image. It's from the Tumalo Irrigation District over in Central Oregon. And I'll just read from it here. Home seeker, do you want a choice, rich farm with an abundance of water in a most delightful climate? Free homes. 5 minutes of your time in reading this book will inform you how the government will permit you to own from 40 to 160 acres in fertile and prosperous Crook County, Oregon. If you don't read it, someone else will, and thereby prosper. Better read it. So this was the sense of the time, was just like, there's all this space and it's being wasted. Come on and put water on it. And the reason you had to put water on it is back to that map that showed the whole United States, and there just wasn't the abundance of water falling out of the sky. Short side note, I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, surrounded by soybeans and corn. And when I first came west, I was like, what are all those circles in the desert? Like, I don't understand why things look like that out here. And I finally was like, oh, they have to spray water on their plants to grow them. Unlike where I live, and you just wait till it rains. So just a totally different framework. And we are going to be spending a lot of time talking about irrigation, because across the Western US, about 85% of all water use in a state goes to supporting irrigated agriculture. So watering primarily pasture and forage. Okay, doctrine of prior appropriation. There are 4 fundamental principles to this doctrine. You may have heard first in time, first in right. So that's whoever got first and posted their piece of paper on the tree, then they have the first right to that resource in times of shortage. So second element here, beneficial use, is the basis, measure, and limit of the right. What that means in real words is that you can't count the use of water for something like, I just like the way my asphalt looks when it's wet. Like, that is not a beneficial use. You have to actually be doing something valuable with the water, and typically that's something economically value. And you can't be like, well, I'm going to grow crops, but my crops just like to be buried in 100 feet of water. Like, that's excessive. That would not be beneficial use. However, it's not defined. So it's kind of an open-ended definition here in Oregon. You also needed to have a diversion of the water from a natural source. So just having water in a river wasn't good enough. You actually had to pull it out before you could have a right to it. And then you had to have intent to pull that water out and put it to beneficial use. So if a rock slide came down and blocked the river and just happened to let that water come up and onto your land, that didn't count for a water right. Okay, so first in time, first in right. This is the one where when there's not enough water to go around, the senior water rights, so the ones with the older dates, get priority to that water. And so that's where you get the situation where those old water rights, sometimes like 1850s, 1860s, are getting full allocations. And those new water rights, or those junior water rights, which in some cases could be like an 1860, 1870 water right, is getting nothing. And only those oldest water rights are getting their water. Here it is in action. Upstream, you've got this junior user. They have the example of the 1970 water right. And then the senior user who's downstream using the 1910 water right. So if there's not enough water and 1910 isn't getting what they need, then they can actually have the state shut off this junior user upstream. Doesn't matter what they're growing, doesn't matter if it's something really valuable. The person who has the oldest water right wins. These are different types of beneficial use. Irrigation, mining, stock watering, domestic, and other non-wasteful economic activities. We're going to go quick here. Historically, leaving that water in stream was waste. So, there was this idea that any drop of water that made it to the ocean was a wasted drop. And so ecological use in the river could not, under those 4 pillars, be considered a beneficial use because there was no diversion. Only in 1987 did leaving water rights in the river for certain in-stream uses actually become recognized as a water right. So think back to 1840s, you've got your first water rights through posting on the tree. 140 years later, finally you can protect the water that's in the river. Again, water is publicly owned in Oregon. However, the rights to use that water are privately owned. So that's an important distinction. It sounds like it's the same thing, but it's not. The water itself flowing in the river is all of our water. However, people can get a right to use that water through the water right permitting system. And the Oregon Water Resources Department is the agency that governs those water rights. Here's the process real quick. You apply, you get a permit, then you prove up. So you show that you're actually using your permit the way that that you are granted the authority to do. You then get a water rights certificate. And if you want to, you can change certain aspects of that certificate through what's called a transfer process. If you don't use your water right, then it can be canceled for non-use. I hate to go so quick for you guys, but we're covering a lot. Restrictions to water rights, you can only use them the way that they are described on your water rights certificate. So you can only use them on a certain place. You can only divert it at a certain place. You can only use it for a certain type of use. You only get a maximum amount that you can access, and you can only access it by a certain rate. So that's basically, if you think about how big could your hose be, you know, that would be rate. And then the annual amount would be basically like how deep, if you put all of your water onto a field, would that be. Use it or lose it is supposed to be like a non, not finding the word, basically so that you couldn't come in and just like say, oh, I'm using all these water rights and sit on them and wait. Non-speculation, that's the word I'm looking for. So the idea was if you didn't use your water rights beneficially once every 5 years, then those water rights would become subject to forfeiture and canceled. However, in practice, it's usually like neighbors on neighbors. So like one neighbor would be like, oh, that guy hasn't used his water right in a while, and now he's trying to use it again. Now I'm going to try to get those water rights canceled so that I can get more water rights myself. So unfortunately, like that's not the way it was designed to be used, but that's the way that it has been used for quite some time. This is a really awful word, appurtenancy. Basically a long way of saying that water rights are attached to the land where they're used. If the land is sold, that water right goes with the sale unless it's explicitly carved off from the sale. A water right can be picked up and moved to another place, but it has to go through that transfer process through the Water Resources Department. And in-stream water rights can only be used in a certain place as well. They have a designated start and end spot. We've talked a bit about in-stream use. The big problem with in-stream water rights is that if you're applying for new ones after 1987, you can imagine that those are the most junior on the system. So if there's not enough water in the river for fish, like in many cases, too bad, so sad. However, you can transfer, so you can take that water right that was previously used for irrigation, for instance, with like, I don't know, 1870 priority date, and transfer that through the Water Resources Department to in-stream use. And then it will carry that 1870 priority date into the river. So then you might actually be able to save some of the water when there's not enough to go around. This says basically that. And then there's a neat tool on this last bullet called split season in-stream leasing. And that allows for a water user to use their water right for the existing purpose, usually irrigation, for the first part of the growing season when there's a lot more water. And then during the second part of the season, they would protect that water right in the river when fish really need it and growing conditions aren't as good. And that program was actually slated to sunset at the end of this year. And legislation was passed during the 2023 session that's already been signed into law that allows that program to be permanent and removes a 10-year cap on participation. So how's it going? Well, not so good. In the beginning of this year, an advisory report came out. It would have been called an audit, but they looked more broadly across multiple agencies. And you can see the title here: State leadership must take action to protect water security for all Oregonians. I just want to read verbatim one of the quotes from this report because it hits hard. Many communities are already struggling with water security and inequity, but as climate change advances, water insecurity may ultimately threaten the environmental and economic well-being of the entire state, even rendering some regions economically unviable and difficult to inhabit. So, on that happy note, here's part of the reason for that. There are 14 different state agencies in partnership with federal agencies, tribal governments, local jurisdictions, utilities, private landowners, NGOs, all that are like trying to steward this water resource. One example being that Water Resources Department manages how much water you can use, but the Department of Environmental Quality manages how clean that water is. And the Oregon Health Authority manages drinking water, and the Oregon Department of Agriculture manages agricultural water quality. And then, you know, that's only 4 examples I gave, and then there's 10 others that have a nexus to water. Another problem, we've got natural stream flow being the very lowest when demand is the highest. This example chart comes from the Integrated Water Resources Strategy. And you can see here, the blue line is typical stream flow distribution, where you have a drop off in late spring as that snowmelt ends. Meanwhile, your crop requirements go from basically 0 around that same time up to spiking in the middle of the year when it's hot and dry and rivers already have the least. And the same thing going with municipal, where the highest water use, highest water demand is in that summertime period. I'm going to skip over this. This basically shows just how in-stream water rights function, but goes into a little more detail than we have time for, and I want to leave lots of time for Lisa. If you apply for a new water right, Water Resources Department is going to, the first step is looking at water availability. They have a system that looks at how much water do they deem to be there in the system, in the river at that particular point, and how much has already been allocated for existing uses. If that's a positive number, so this last column, the net water available, then it's possible that you might get your water permit. If it's 0 or less, as if you could have negative flow in a river, then you're not going to get your water permit. As an aside, Water Resources Department's water availability model is on the brink of collapse, but good news, they just got full funding for an upgrade to the model using more modern data as the basis for the model. Drought is all around us. It is, I phrase it here as opportunities and challenges. This is from the most recent drought conditions report. I encourage you to actually sign up for them on the Oregon Water Resources Department's website. I think every 2 weeks they update the drought report during the summer. And it might actually be all year long, but I really look at it in the summer. And you can see how over the course of 2 weeks, this map will change of which parts of the state have been determined to be in drought. And so right now, 76.79% of the state is in some kind of drought conditions, with 49% of the state in moderate or worse drought. This image here on the top shows the amount of state in different drought classes over the last 10 years. And so you can see things got really bad a few years ago. They're a little better now, but we've got a long track record of ongoing drought. It gets people to think about water problems, which is a good thing, but it's a bad thing in that most of our drought tools are designed to help us through 1 year and assume that things are going to get better the next year. And as many of us are experiencing, and as scientists are showing, things aren't getting better from year to year. This is the percent of average precipitation right now in the state on that left. It's that really yucky looking color. And then on the right, we've got our average temperatures. So it's hot and dry. I mean, I know we had a good winter, but this is where we're heading. And then I think this map is really telling as well, because if you look at Oregon on the soil moisture indicator, we're in bad shape. I mean, I don't know if there's a state out there that is in a lower overall percentage than we are. So I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, but we need to be planning for a more water constrained future. Similar situation, precip is looking okay, temperatures are looking hot. And stream flows have dropped off through much of the state. We're looking at significantly below average stream flows. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa to dive into a real place and talk about some real approaches to making it work.
Thanks, Caylin. Yeah, I'm curious. I know we were going to kind of hold questions to the end, but I'm curious if anyone had any like clarifying questions about just the system of prior appropriation and kind of how that functions, since from here we're going to dive into the examples of how it plays out on the ground in different places, and then specifically go over some of the things some of the workarounds we're using to try to get water where it's needed. So does anybody have any burning questions? I can't see everybody.
Folks can raise their hands as a reaction, and we can stack that way.
All right.
I have one quick question. And this might be really too detailed, but maybe a quick answer just on how does we talked about kind of surface water, groundwater, is it the same type of right? Do you still apply in the same way?
I can quickly take that one. Yes, since 1955, you now apply to the state. They look at whether they can say that there's water available. And then if there is, you go through that same permitting process. Groundwater was previously seen as like the backstop to be able to address these surface water shortages. And now, it's becoming clear that our groundwater resources are not limitless either. And we've greatly overdrawn our groundwater bank account across the state as well.
Yeah, and I will just add that as a result of that, the state's actually in the process of doing some rulemaking associated with the groundwater rules. So there may be some shifts in the way that new groundwater is appropriated, but as far as I know, it won't retroactively apply to anyone that already has a groundwater permit.
Great. I think we'll top the 3 hands we have up. We'll do 3 questions and then we'll jump to the next, if that's okay with you all.
Yeah.
So I see Megan is on top.
Do people with senior water rights ever have their water shut off by the water board?
Curtailed.
Or not by the water board, I don't know. Yes, sure.
Yeah, the Oregon Water Resources Department. Curtailed, I would say yes. I don't know about shut off completely. Maybe you have different examples, Caylin, but I'll say in the Deschutes Basin right now, one of the senior water rights holders is delivering 60% of their allotment of water right now. And that may actually be less to do with the department and more to do with interbasin discussions about sort of sharing of the shortage. But yes, I think it definitely happens. I mean, there are certain streams that run entirely dry and then nobody gets water. And that happens right about now in a lot of parts of the state. So
yeah, I'll only add that senior and junior are relative. So sometimes 1970 might be senior. Other times 1970 might be junior. So there's not a class of water rights that falls into senior water rights. It's just whether one water right is older than another water right.
And they all are subject to curtailment when there's not enough water. They just happen in that order of whoever has the oldest date kind of has the water the longest.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Alice.
Hi, thanks for the presentation today. I was just wondering, a lot of the farmers that I work with, there seems to be a prevailing wisdom that like getting a new water right is not possible? And is that because they're not being given out, or just because your water will be shut off so quickly because you're the juniorist of the junior if you get a water right in 2023? So just, I was wondering if you had any insight on that, whether or not it's like how many new water rights are being given out, or is that slowing down as well, and if it's just not worth it to try to pursue it.
Well, looking back at that slide that Caylin you just flew through, the Water Resource Department will do an analysis anytime they get a new application for a water right. And in most cases, the state is over appropriated, meaning in the summer months when people are wanting water rights, there's almost no water to be given out in really anywhere. So it would not really work to apply for a new water right. And they do an analysis that Caylin had one of those slides kind of later in the presentation showing that they're going to figure out how many water rights have been given out, what the natural flow conditions are, and if it's a positive number, then they might consider a new water right. But more often than not, in the summer months when most growers are wanting water rights, there really isn't any water to be had.
This thing I just pulled up for shows what Lisa's talking about. So this slide shows summertime calculated water availability. And that tan color is not a good color. It means that it's already been determined to not have any water available to support new water rights in those areas. If you're in one of the blue zones, so in that central Willamette Valley or far northeastern Oregon, or some of the small coastal systems, you might have a little bit of a positive number in some of those. But if you're not in those areas, then you're probably SOL. You're probably out of luck.
Great, thanks, Penny.
I was just wondering what the discourse is around like the perverse incentives created with the use it or lose it policy. Because I know a number of farmers who use their water right even when they don't need to because they don't want it to be canceled.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to have you hold on to that question, and I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the programs that we have going on in the Deschutes Basin to address that, among other things, because we do know that that is a prevailing problem or issue, is that everyone is, water is valuable. It makes land more valuable, so people want to hold on to their water rights, even if they don't necessarily need them. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And I do think, Caylin, you might be a better person to answer this question, but doesn't the state allow for folks to not necessarily use their water in drought years if drought is declared in a specific county?
Yeah, there's a couple of exceptions to forfeiture. One being if you have a facility that is ready, willing, and able to use your full scope of your water right, then you don't need to irrigate. And then another one that just passed in this legislative session is if there is a drought declaration in your county, then your non-use of water doesn't count toward those 5 years of non-use that would then make your water right subject to forfeiture. So those are some small steps. I mean, the ready, willing, able exemption is massive. Other states don't have that. So there is, to your point, Penny, there's lots of wasted water of people just like greening up once every 3, 4, 5 years. But there's being some small steps to try to reduce that perverse incentive.
All right.
I do see Natalie's hand up.
Yeah, so on water rights, this is something I didn't understand correctly for a long time, but that right is attached to the district. It's not a patchwork of individual owners and how early their water right is. An entire area would be serviced by an irrigation district that has one date as their water right. So at least that's how it works in Central Oregon. I'm assuming that's the whole thing. So my question is, how does that work with applying for new rights? Wouldn't you have to apply within the district that is physically able to service that area? And wouldn't that go with whatever date that district has?
So you have it partially correct. A lot of water rights are like within irrigation districts. But the water rights themselves are actually tied to specific parcels, which is really confusing. But that is the way it works in Central Oregon. But believe it or not, there actually are water rights holders out there that are not within districts. They're not getting deliveries from districts. They're pulling water directly from a water source. And that happens, like, for instance, we have a project on the Crooked River side of the Deschutes Basin right now, where we are working with a bunch of landowners in a small tributary to the Crooked River that have direct water rights to that particular tributary. That happens to be a very important anadromous fish run. And so we are trying to restore the flows to that particular creek. And we're asking those water rights holders to transfer their water rights in stream. So leave that water in the creek in exchange for water that would get to them through a district. So anyway, it's very confusing, and now I'm forgetting what your actual question is, but both individual water rights holders and district water rights. And I know what you were asking. If folks within a district want a new water right, there is a method within districts to kind of get on a list and see if you can get a water right transferred from someone within a district to a specific parcel of property that you may have that you don't have a water right on. So there is kind of like an individual district process that is a little bit outside of OWRD's process, but not all water rights are within districts. A lot of them are, though, in the basin. So
is that true statewide, that a lot of the water rights are tied to a district that services an area generally?
Yeah, there's depending.
Okay.
There's over like 93 or 94,000 water rights that have been recognized in the state of Oregon, and not nearly that many irrigation districts, even though, irrigation districts may have 5, 10, 20 different irrigation rights. But many of them are just single rights for a single piece of land. And I've actually asked Water Resources Congress a few times, like, hey, is there a map that shows the boundaries of all of the irrigation districts in the state of Oregon? And they're like, that would be really helpful. And no, we don't have that.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
something to think about getting, though. That would be a really great resource.
Lisa, should I handle the next? Like, I'll navigate for you?
Yeah, if you don't mind, you can just switch me over to the next slide and I'll just give a quick overview of where we're talking about. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about the Deschutes Basin and about how a lot of these rules, prior appropriation doctrine are applied and how they cause problems in our basin. So this is just a quick overview to show you exactly where the Deschutes Basin is, right in the center of the state. It's the second largest river basin in the state after the Willamette. It flows from south to north. And yeah, so that's the Deschutes River Basin. In the next slide, just want to show that prior appropriation has resulted in this water rights allocation, which is actually pretty close to what it is across the Western United States, except for, I would say, in the Western United States, there might be fewer in-stream water rights than there are in the Deschutes Basin. But generally speaking, agriculture in the Deschutes Basin has 86% of the water rights, and, across the West, it's 80 to 90% of water rights are given out for agriculture. And that has everything to do with the history and the colonization and development of redevelopment of the West Coast. And yeah, everyone's always really surprised to see, though, that in the case of the Deschutes Basin, we only have 2% of water rights are allocated to municipal uses. And that's like all the cities and municipalities within Central Oregon. So they use water pretty efficiently, and everyone always likes to blame breweries and golf courses, but I'm here to say that breweries and golf courses are a really small percentage of water use, even in the high desert where we have lots of those.
I will say over on the coast, breweries and seafood processing and tourism often can have a really big impact on stream flows, where irrigated ag has less of an impact. So I'm only jumping in here to say each basin is different, and where there is a lot of irrigated ag, this is absolutely the typical distribution you would see. But for some of the producers on this, or organizations that are on this call, some of your members might have a really different distribution based on what part of the state that they're in.
Thank you for that. So yeah, so going to the next slide here is zooming in on that that basin map. Right here, we're sort of looking at the upper basin, which is actually to the south of the former Oregon map that we just showed. So the headwaters of the Deschutes Basin are Little Lava Lake, and the Deschutes then passes through two reservoirs, Wickiup being the larger reservoir here, and then travels north through Bend, and then up through Redmond and Madras and up north. And all the different splotches of colors on this map denote the different irrigation districts in the Deschutes Basin. So this gets to Natalie's question. Most of the water rights in this basin are through irrigation districts, and they have different priority dates. I think I have another slide that specifically talks about the priority dates. But the two ones I want to point out, because they're the ones that are the focus of much conversation and discussion about how to sort of fix the problems of getting water where it needs to be in the Deschutes Basin, are Central Oregon Irrigation District, which we refer to as COID, and North Unit Irrigation District, which we refer to as NUID. So that's the green, the light green color, and this like purpley pink color. Basically, when this area was settled, or I should say resettled, it was people started kind of landing in Bend. And so water rights, going back to what Caylin described of hammering notices to trees and putting water to use, that started happening like closer to the city center. And so COID has a 1900 water right. And sort of as development continued, folks started moving farther north. And this area up in the north near Madras, North Unit Irrigation District, wasn't really like settled until 1913, which sounds like quite a long time ago, but in relative to water rights, it really wasn't. By 1913, the river was already over allocated, which means there was no more water to give North Unit farmers to use to farm the lands up in the Madras area. So the way in which they got around the lack of water was to build a reservoir, and that is Wickiup Reservoir down here in the southern part of the basin. And in this reservoir, they store water all winter long to meet the needs of these irrigators in the summer months. And so that has had really drastic impacts on the river and the habitat, because effectively they have turned the river off at Wickiup Reservoir starting in late October, early November. They took a trickle. There's a trickle of water coming out of that reservoir. This is a good depiction of what happens. So they're holding back all the flow. Historically, until really recently, they only let about 20 CFS out of the dam in the winter months. But due to a habitat conservation plan and a threatened species, the spotted frog, those flows are now up to over 100 CFS, and they're going to go up in years to come under that plan. But then, yeah, in the summer months, they basically would just flood that stretch of river, turn it on and use the upper river as an irrigation diversion until they get to Bend, which is where all of those irrigation districts pull water out of the river and divert in Bend. And if you just really quickly go back, Caylin, to the last slide, I just want to point out that this whole system was engineered 100 years ago to be completely gravity fed. So all the irrigation districts, including this pink area up here, are taking the water out of the Deschutes River here in Bend, and all that water is traveling over hand-dug canals through porous basalt rock to reach these lands out here. And the reason they had to do that is because this is a canyon. And in 1913, there was no way for them to pump water from Lake Billy Chinook up to the plateaus to water that area. So it's a completely gravity fed system. And it loses 50% of the water on the way, which means that they have to divert twice as much water from the river as what the farmer gets to use on the farm. All right, so going one more. Yep. Okay, so this is a hydrograph which shows flow over time, right? So the months of the year are down here starting in October, which is the beginning of the water year, and going through September. The blue graph shows what the Deschutes River used to look like before we started storing and diverting water for agriculture. The Deschutes has historically been one of the most stable flowing rivers in the country, if not the world, because it is a groundwater fed system. So it doesn't respond to rain on snow events or like tons and tons of snow turning into runoff in the spring and like causing the hydrograph to go up. Instead, it's just there are springs feeding the river year round, and it pumps out about the same amount of water. So this is what the hydrograph used to look like. Then we built Wickiup Reservoir, and this is what the hydrograph has looked like for 60 plus years. So we've completely altered the natural course of that river. Going to the next slide, these are some of the different irrigation districts in the state, in the basin. The big ones that I'm highlighting again are Central Oregon Irrigation District and North Unit. And you can tell just by looking at the number of acres that they irrigate, that the reason we're focusing on these two is because they have, they're irrigating the largest number of acres, and they're the biggest water users. Not to say the others aren't important, but yeah, we're focusing most of our efforts in working with these two districts and trying to sort of equal the scales a little bit, with these guys getting all the water they need and these guys often getting very little water. All right, so annual diversions. COID on average diverts 300,000 acre feet, and North Unit 188,000 acre feet. And so COID, I just want to point out, is diverting like vastly more water than North Unit Irrigation District, even though they are irrigating fewer acres. So like last year, going back to 2022, when we were in extreme drought, most of the Central Oregon Irrigation District farmers received their full allotment, which is like something around 5 acre feet per acre. So that's 5 feet of water covering an acre for the season. North Unit Irrigation District farmers, in comparison, received 6 inches of water in the 2022 irrigation season. So you can't grow anything in the high desert with 6 inches of water. And the only way in which those guys were able to grow anything was by basically leasing more land than they needed to grow, and what they sort of stacking all their water rights on one plot, if that makes sense. And I can go into that a little bit more later, but yeah, it was really bleak. So next slide. So we had a big study that wrapped up a handful of years ago, the Upper Deschutes Basin study, where we did a whole analysis of supply and demand in the Deschutes Basin, and basically tried to project where the unmet needs are. And in our basin, 80% of the unmet needs are in the in-stream category, meaning those sections of river that run completely dry, which would be the Upper Deschutes in the winter months and the Middle Deschutes in the summer months, which is where all the water is diverted for agriculture. There is some need. This 20% in ag is that sort of balancing the scales between COID and North Unit. And the hatching and the color, I don't want to get into this too much, but municipalities, in order to access water in the Deschutes Basin, they need to mitigate for their use. And they do this by essentially acquiring older water rights and putting those water rights in stream so that can be pumped for municipal uses. So that's kind of why there's this hatching of the municipal needs over the in stream. All right, going to the next slide. I already talked about this a little bit, but yeah, last year, North Unit Irrigation District got 25% of their allocation of water which really amounted to like, 6 inches of water per acre. So not enough to grow crops. You also all probably know that the city of Bend and cities of Bend, Redmond, Prineville are some of the fastest growing cities in Oregon, if not across the West right now. So the cities are basically very interested in acquiring more water for those growing communities, even though their usage is pretty small on that pie chart. So what are we doing to try to help deal with all this inequity across the basin? Well, the Deschutes River Conservancy has been around for, going on 30 years, and we work collaboratively. We were actually formed by the tribes of Warm Springs, irrigation interests and environmental interests back in 1996. And our board is it's a diverse group of folks, and we make all of our decisions by consensus. And we work with all the basin stakeholders, also trying to solve these problems by consensus. So we're not out there litigating. We're really like sitting at the table with everyone, trying to help figure out how we can make things better. Water conservation through infrastructure improvements is one of our big programs. And what that basically means is, we just talked about the hand-dug canals in porous volcanic rock losing 50% of their water. Well, we're trying to figure out a way to get as much money as we can to pipe those canals, so that water can be delivered to the farms like in its entirety. So basically only needing to divert half as much as we diverted previously, and the farms still getting what they needed. We also are working with farmers directly to try and bring money into the basin to help folks convert from inefficient ways of irrigating like flood irrigation to more efficient ways, everything from center pivots and wheel lines to drip irrigation. And I think we have, if you just want to show the next slide really quickly. Yeah, so this is the little schematic of the porous canals losing all of their water. And then in the next one, we've got a picture of piping those canals. And I also just want to put in a plug for piping in places where you have a decent amount of fall between where the diversion is and where things are delivered on farm. These pipes also provide an opportunity to save enormous amounts of energy, because in a lot of cases, once an irrigation ditch is piped, you can not only deliver the correct amount of water at the correct time, but you can also deliver pressurized water. So you can alleviate the need for farmers to have to pump. And in some cases, you're actually generating hydropower, or you could generate hydropower in some of these piped systems. So that's what we're doing with that. The next thing is water banking. So the Deschutes River Conservancy, for basically since its inception, has worked to do a lot of the things that Caylin already explained. So in-stream leases and transfers. We've been doing those in the Deschutes Basin since the mid-90s, and we've managed to restore somewhere close to 300 CFS to rivers and streams in the basin as a result of tools like that. We are expanding that program and trying to kind of put it all under one umbrella that we're calling a water bank, which essentially is a governance structure. It's not a physical building like the schematic here, but the concept is the same. And so to somebody's question, I think it was Penny's question earlier, we're effectively trying to figure out like, how can we incentivize people who don't need their water? Like for instance, that person who's maybe just watering so they can keep their water right. How can we incentivize that person to either lease their water in stream, which still protects their water right, or potentially in our case, put that water right to work in North Unit Irrigation District during the summer months, and in exchange, North Unit Irrigation District can release an equivalent amount of water out of Wickiup Reservoir in the winter months. So basically getting like, we're double dipping, and we're helping solve the farming crisis in North Unit, and also hopefully putting more water in the upper Deschutes in the winter months. So we have done a pilot program for the last 3 years, and we are going to continue. We have a big grant from Reclamation to continue to build out the water bank, and we're in the process of doing that as we speak.
I wanted to interject quickly, and for folks who might not be as familiar with these, what a cubic foot per second or CFS looks like. If you imagine a basketball rolling by and like one basketball going by every second, that's a cubic foot per second. So when Lisa talks about restoring 300 CFS or cubic feet per second of flow in the Deschutes, that's like 300 basketballs rolling by every second that wouldn't have been rolling by of water in the river.
I love that. I've never heard that, but I'm stealing that from you to use in future presentations.
Sports.
Yeah, water volumes are really hard to convey. So yeah, thank you for that, Caylin. So the other program that I talked a little bit about in my introduction is the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative. And essentially, you know, the Upper Deschutes Basin study that was completed in 2019 was a study to look at supply and demand in the basin and potential tools that could help meet the demands. And we parlayed that particular study into this collaborative, which now has, you know, I think about 46 different members. It's facilitated jointly by the Deschutes River Conservancy and the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council. We have 3 chairs, a tribal member, a county commissioner, and an irrigation district manager. And all of these interests are sitting together, trying to put together a management plan for the basin. So by consensus. So that is no small feat, but we are making great progress, and we're throwing as much innovation as we possibly can into that plan, including the water bank and all the things that fall under that, and the conservation programs that we talked about. So we're basically trying to use all the tools to circumnavigate prior appropriation and get the water where it needs to be. So with that, I'm going to pass it on back to you, Caylin.
All right, I'm going to do another quick case study and then we're going to wrap up. So next we're going to 15 Mile Creek near the Dalles. Here's our overview. Here's Northwest Oregon. And this river flows also from south to north. 54 miles long, consists of several different creek systems. Home to some neat fish like summer steelhead and Pacific lamprey. This to the earlier question, there's 70 landowners, each with their own water rights. So there's 3,400 acres within this zone that have water rights, but there's no irrigation district. There's not enough water for the river from June through September, and it's also been listed on the 303D list for water quality impairments for temperature and sediment. We developed, and when I say we, I should say I worked previously with the Freshwater Trust running the stream flow restoration program. This is actually supposed to be in this order, so we're going to take these slightly out of order. First off, in 2009, there was a terrible fish kill. Where there were, I don't even know how many, but many dead baby fish. And that resulted because of long period of hot weather and really low flows. And the feds came in and said, this happened because of the irrigation withdrawals. And if you don't do something to stop this from happening again, you will be facing potential civil and criminal liability. And so you need to put together a strategy in order to avoid that from happening. This is where the Freshwater Trust stepped in and worked with local irrigators to help put together the plan, which they called the 15 Mile Action to Stabilize Temperature, or FAST. And the way that it worked, and I apologize for this being out of order, the components were, first, there was a stream flow temperature model that was developed, where it would take daily forecasts of weather and flow in the river and like combine those up to come up with this is what we think the water temperature is going to be for the next 7 days. And if it was expected to be above a certain threshold, then an alert would go out to irrigators who had signed up within that creek system. And if they got an alert, then they could shut off their irrigation and lead to a bump in stream flows. If they did that, they would get paid. They would also be able to show I was not diverting if there was a fish kill that happened. And then there was measurement, 4 different gauges through the course of this 54-mile long tributary, so they could see in real time what were the flows at these different spots in the river. And it's ongoing to this day. Let's get back to where we started. Since that time, there have been no fish kills, even though there's been much hotter temperatures than were experienced in 2009 for much longer. So the reason that it worked is they had that historic flow and climate data. They had the real-time measurement of flows. They knew that if they didn't work together, things were gonna get real hard for irrigated ag. And they had a really close-knit community, combined with there being funding available to preserve the fish species that were in that river. And so with all of those inputs, they were able to come up with this model that exists, again, outside of prior appropriation. And it allows farmers who participate to get that income stream even when they're not growing the crops that they otherwise would be. Understanding that these aren't food crops like tomatoes or melons. These tend to be more like alfalfa. So it could go for a few days without getting irrigated. And it just, again, shows that if you give people the information that they need to make decisions, then people can often have a much broader path, like a much more options to deal with the problem that's in front of them, instead of being like, oh, well, there's not enough water and now I can't irrigate it. We're trying to really push to get more of these tools out there so that people have more options when we do hit shortage. Let's see if I can get back to this right. That said, we've got a big challenge here in that only 1 in 6 water rights in Oregon are required to measure and report water use, and only 75% of those actually follow that requirement. So there are many places where the state just has really no idea how much water is getting used, for what purpose, when, if it's being used in the right place. And so it makes it difficult to be able to come up with these proactive approaches to managing water. It is not all doom and gloom. You have things that you can do and that your members can do to help make things better. So we want to leave you with this. Please, please, please testify on bills before the legislature. In this last session, we saw more bills introduced on water than we've ever seen before. And having watched many of the public hearings and committee meetings about those bills, when farmers and producers and ranchers show up and talk about their water issues, people sit up and pay attention. Like, decision makers are hungry for these on the ground stories of how are you impacted by water and lack thereof. So do that. Contact your legislator and tell them that you care about water and that you want them to care about water. Because I can say a lot of legislators don't currently really care about water because they're busy caring about a lot of other really important things. So the more that you can help to elevate this with your representatives and your senators, please do. Support agency budgets. I mean, it's not sexy, but we really do need people at the state level who are tasked with stewarding these resources to actually have the funding to do that stewardship. If there's local water planning happening in your community, see if you can carve out the time to participate in it. Your voice does matter, and there is a growing interest in replicating the sort of basin level planning that folks in the Deschutes have been undertaking for the last several decades. and this should say tell your story, but I kind of like tell you story. So that then kind of goes back up to all of these other ones. Like, tell the story of how water is impacting you, and do it in the forums where decisions are made, because I can tell you it's the same people showing up, dictating what the water future is, and we need more people at the table. I commit to you that when these opportunities come across my radar, where we could really use a broader suite of stakeholders represented, like, I'm gonna be reaching out to Andrew and Megan and be like, hey, let's see if there's some people who can make time to show up and tell their story, or tell the you story. With that, here's our info to get in touch with us. Lisa, I hope you don't mind, I harvested your contact info from your email.
Definitely.
And I think that is the end of what we have for our presentation. So this is the discussion Q&A time.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing too. The state is really interested in what's called place-based planning. And they just, as part of the legislative session, have put some money aside to sort of promote that kind of planning, realizing that not all basins are exactly the same, and realizing that those 14 agencies that Caylin talked about, all trying to manage water from the state level, gets really clunky. So yeah, I just wanted to underscore that there are already, I don't know, 5 or 6 different organizations, 4 official across the state, right? And then I feel like the Deschutes isn't considered one, and then there's at least another one that I know of. So there's a few groups already out there working on plans, and I bet more to come in the future. So and everybody is invited to sit at the table. And so yes, please get engaged.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caylin and Lisa. This is really informative. Let's do a stack again with questions, and call on folks as they pop up. Megan.
So I would love to just check and see if I'm understanding correctly, and I know that I'm not really totally grasping it. But your presentations were excellent and very clear. And but Lisa, in the situation where you've got folks collaborating to solve problems and make a water plan for the region, I can imagine that there are farmers and ranchers that are pissed off. They are having their water. I know them. They're having their water curtailed. They don't have enough to water, and then they're seeing this real inequity where other farmers and ranchers are getting plenty, and in some case, somebody's growing food and somebody's growing alfalfa, and they're feeling like it's not equitable or just. And many of us have heard those stories. When those folks are when people are at the table together, are there farmers and ranchers like talking to each other, or is somebody representing them, or how does that work? How are those problems solved in that collaborative process, or are they? Is it a different process that you're talking about, like a very different level?
That's a really good question, and I will say that the groups that are probably sort of the most vocal and in opposition to some of the things that are happening in the basin, like for instance, the Habitat Conservation Plan. There was an article in the bulletin, I think today or yesterday, about farmers traveling to DC to talk about basically dismantling the Endangered Species Act, because they're scapegoating the Endangered Species Act as being like the cause of the water woes in the basin. And so I'm sad to say that like that contingent doesn't show up to collaborative meetings. Like, I mean, not to say that we can't all sort of anticipate what those folks are thinking and saying, but unfortunately there are groups that aren't showing up and that we don't have a chance to dialogue with and to try to talk about some of the solutions that we're trying to employ in the basin. And yeah, and the HCP and the Endangered Species Act gets scapegoated a lot. But you only need to look south to the Klamath Basin to see an example of a basin where there isn't a habitat conservation plan that affords some protection to the irrigators, to sort of see what the outcome would be without that plan. So yeah, and then there's another group I'll talk about really quickly that has shown up to a few DRC events recently, but that generally speaking is also not at the table. And that's a group of folks that are really, really fond of their irrigation canals and really see them as sort of private water features. They bought property on the canal, and they, you know, it runs seasonally, and they have loved and enjoyed the open water feature. And so the piping of those canals is really not something that they want to see. But I'm also sad to say that they're also not at the table, or at least they haven't come to participate in conversations for the most part, to learn about why we're piping those canals and the benefits of piping the canals and how that is actually restoring the Deschutes River, which is a whole lot older and a much more functioning system than an irrigation canal, which effectively is devoid of fish, fish screens and other things in place. So yeah, so I'm sad to say that like all the folks that really like are out there and are vocal and are litigating to kind of see their interests are met are not showing up to collaborative meetings, and that's a little frustrating. I mean, maybe frustrating, but also maybe nice, I guess, depending on how you think about it. Yeah, in terms of how to deal with those interests, I mean, whenever I've had an opportunity, like we had a recent seminar where the Save Our Canals folks showed up and were really, you know, very angry and wanted to just have their message sort of heard. In general, I think my technique is to listen. In that particular forum, it wasn't the best forum for listening. But yeah, that's usually the technique, is to listen and try to understand people's perspectives, and at the same time educate them on the importance of some of the actions that we're taking that aren't super popular amongst every interest at the table. So that was long-winded, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, so there's not really individual level negotiations. It's higher. I'm just trying to get a handle on what we had the case study shared from Spring Alaska Olson, and trying to think about how that translates to a planning process like the one you described, her situation.
So like, for instance, she did note in that case study, the Deschutes Water Bank, right? And so trying to incentivize certain irrigators who are not using their water rights to be able to put those water rights in the water bank and still potentially be protected from forfeiture, which, you know, is a concern of a lot of folks when they're not using their water rights. Potentially incentivize them financially for putting their water in the water bank, and then be able to offer that water up to irrigation districts that are in shortages. So that's the kind of program that we're trying to work on. And it kind of circumnavigates prior appropriation, because instead of just going to the next person in line, you know, we're essentially like sometimes skipping irrigation districts and trying to put the water where on the ground where it's really needed and where it can be best used.
Thank you.
Heidi.
Hi, Caylin, Lisa. Thank you so much for the presentations. I have a much better understanding of water rights than I did before we started. I have a larger area question of thinking about the like states that we border, Idaho, Washington, right? There's like shared water in some places in British Columbia. Are there any organizations that are working like collaboratively from state to state?
I'll share that there are certain I mean, unfortunately it tends to be by interest, right? Like there's conservation groups that work across boundaries, there's ag groups that work across boundaries. For I'll answer narrowly for Wild Salmon Center. We're super focused on coastal watersheds that still have functioning and intact habitat and relatively healthy runs of salmon. So that for us kind of cuts out the whole Columbia Basin that crosses many other borders. But if you look at other states, like there's the whole, you're probably reading about like the Colorado River system and the upper basin states, lower basin states. That's a really unsatisfying answer. But it tends to be a lot more on the federal level because you're crossing those state boundaries. And then on the international level, the Columbia River Treaty is up for negotiation or is currently being renegotiated right now. We're not involved in that, but lots of people are. And then on a much smaller level, you know, the Walla Walla has a collaborative that's working on both sides of the border. So I hate to say it, but it's like it really depends on where you are and what outcomes you're trying to get to, what uses you're trying to support, and really who's at the table and what legal framework you're operating under.
Yeah, I think there's more of like a more of devolving power to the local level. It seems to be happening more, or just more of an acknowledgement of these things needing to be tackled on a basin by basin scale, as opposed to being able to like enact a framework that might work across the entire Western United States. You know, we were constantly running into like, there's no one size fits all solution to these situations. And so, yeah, I don't know of any organization. I mean, I will put a plug in for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. You know, they run a Columbia Basin water transactions program. And so they essentially work with groups like the Deschutes River Conservancy. They're a funder of some of the leasing program and some of the other programs that we have, water rights transactions. So they're working at the Columbia Basin level. And then, of course, there's all the interstate, you know, packs and things that Caylin just chatted about. But for the most part, I see it actually going the opposite direction. Instead of it being like a top-down thing, it's kind of more realizing that we have to have local solutions to a lot of these problems.
I was going to share a quick map of John Wesley Powell's vision, open image in new tab, of what the West would actually look like if we had structured our state boundaries to correspond with
watersheds.
And so
I love that you have this.
Oh yeah. So if you look here at this map, you will see that here on the eastern side is that kind of white line that we looked at on the precipitation map. That would have been the eastern boundary of the arid region. And then there's the coastal zones over beyond the western boundary of the arid region. And then the arid region would be organized by basin, by major river basin. Things would be very different if they had followed John Wesley Powell's recommendations. They did not, and here we are.
Very interesting. Yeah, I feel like, and also with the larger multi-state stuff, it's done depending on the level of crisis, like with the Columbia, it's like the feds are getting involved when it's completely falling apart. Natalie.
Yeah, thanks. I learn new stuff every time I go to one of these, so I appreciate it. I have some questions around following policy that relates to water with the Oregon legislature, and how do we find information during the session about what bills are in play? And then without having our own water experts on staff, how do we find like trusted interpretations of how those bills might affect farmers?
I'll take a stab and then Lisa, please backfill. I'll say, always feel free. We can do like a Reddit AMA, you know, ask me anything. I love being a resource for folks of like, hey, if you ask me what's going on in the Oregon legislature, like a few times during session, Andrew and I were in touch about, here's some summary of bills. I really want to keep this connective tissue going into future sessions. Megan tracks a lot of the water policy issues. And I know folks in Lisa's shop track Oregon water issues. In terms of like who's gonna kind of lay it out for how it impacts farmers, I subscribe to get various industry groups emails during legislative session, and they'll kind of lay out, here's this bill, here's why we support it or oppose it, and then it gives you a high level understanding of how that particular group has digested it. Water is always going to be a personal impact, right? Like it hits everybody in different ways. So I wish there was like this is exactly what it's going to do for farmers, but that's where y'all come in, of like helping the decision makers think through how is this actually going to hit on the ground, and maybe here's a thing that you haven't considered. Super unsatisfying answer. Sorry, Natalie.
Well, do you have any examples of what organizations you might follow to get their interpretations? Because we do that for bills for farmers, right? Like bills that might affect them, putting up that interpretation and like, here's what you need to know. And I know Megan's very involved with that too, and probably some others on this call. I just don't know who to follow on water issues, especially like as they relate to agriculture.
You can follow Oregon Farm Bureau. They will send out a weekly legislative update. And, it's going to be one perspective of what agriculture is, what farming is.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that those updates can be valuable. And then it at least gives you a breadcrumb to be like, okay, who am I going to call next to see if there's maybe a different take on this, this bill. I'll also try to keep being a resource going into the next session.
Yeah, I know we just dipped our toe into the legislative process in a more serious way this last session, and it was all very fast and furious. So we definitely were not unfortunately the organization that was typing out updates and sort of really able to provide that level of outreach to folks, but maybe something that we might be able to do in the future. Yeah, I know Mark Owens, I don't know, does Mark do an actual update? I mean, was he putting anything out specifically?
He put out a few newsletters through the course of the session. League of Women Voters puts out legislative updates. Oregon Environmental Council, Oregon League of Conservation Voters. These are kind of ones just off the top of my head. But yeah, it's
with everything you pretty much have to triangulate. You're gonna have to read all the things, which is not satisfying, but read all the things and try to figure out how it might affect groups. I mean, yeah, it's tough, and it moves quickly. I mean, that's what we observed. So.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a need here for getting that information, triangulating, and then those folks who are working like y'all at FOF directly with the small farmers and interpreting and then putting that out there to your members. Yeah, I think that that's a continued conversation, to like a list building of where you follow, to just even know like, oh, there's stuff coming through the legislature. We're at 4:30. We have one more question. If folks are filing off, don't stay on if you can't. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Cool.
I had a question that was similar to Megan's, actually, about engaging certain groups of farmers. So I encountered this phenomena where there's a class of farmers that just have senior water rights and so are insulated from a lot of things and aren't interested in finding solutions. And so for developing the kinds of solutions you're talking about, in Deschutes County. Is that something that you experienced there, and how did you encounter it? Or is everyone impacted there? Like, how do you get those people to the table?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I don't know that I have a really satisfying answer for it, but we definitely regularly interact with senior water rights holders who are of the, I would say, just to put it really bluntly, the very entitled position of this is mine, and I'm going to use every last drop of it, and I'm not really interested in sharing. It's a huge uphill battle. And particularly if that, person or that mentality is in power, which is the case in some of the, irrigation district boards. So it's just a constant battle. I mean, we just continue to come back with more and more ideas, and we really just don't take no for an answer. It's not a streamlined process, but I mean, frankly, in the Deschutes Basin, Central Oregon Irrigation District, whether they like it or not, they are the reservoir of water that is out there to meet all of the needs across the basin going forward. In-stream needs, North Unit Irrigation District needs, city municipal needs. They have 5.5 acre feet per acre on their water rights certificate. And there are other districts that have 2.5. So there's vast inequity. And we're just going to continue to keep knocking on the door and chipping away and coming up with proposals and hoping for shifts in leadership and shifts in perspective and shifts in culture, because these problems aren't going away. And frankly, it's those senior water rights holders that hold the solution in their hands. And and just sort of teaching folks that, like, it's not an us or them mentality, right? Like, everyone can win in the Deschutes Basin. Like, I feel really passionately and very strongly that if we just get more efficient with our water use, and we allow people who don't want to water their lands to not water their lands, but still potentially retain the water right, value to their land for whatever future, reason that they want it. I think we can solve the problems here. So tenacity, I guess, is like, it's the short answer to that question. So
I'll pile on and add 2 more things. One being an analogy that my friend who's a rancher talks about, which is every person has like an animal has a flight zone, where if you get close enough to that animal from a certain direction, like they'll move. And so it's figuring out, like, what direction do you need to approach that person in order to spark movement, because we're all animals, and hopefully spark them in a movement that's positive and productive. It's like why you don't approach certain livestock from the front, because it's not going to work out well for you, or certain livestock directly from behind, because it's also not going to work out well for you. And the other one is that sometimes you need pressure to make a diamond. And you're just not gonna have much movement until there is something worse that shows up. And I'll highlight the 15-mile example, where there really wasn't much of a reason for those senior users to come to the table until irrigated agriculture and the whole basin was at risk of not happening anymore. And then there were the right conditions for the diamonds to form. So in some cases, you need, Andrew kind of mentioned earlier, like, sometimes you need a crisis. We're not in the business of manufacturing crises, but we are certainly aware of them, and we'll use them to help where we can.
Yeah, definitely. I echo that same thing. Crisis is an opportunity. So drought is not great, but it definitely provides a context for catalysts for people to make changes. unfortunately, the crisis doesn't impact everybody the same, right? Like all in the same storm, everybody has a little bit of a different boat. But yes, a crisis, and who knows? I mean, maybe someday there will be some sort of like broad sweeping, regulatory shift, which is basically what the Colorado is looking at, right? I mean, they were like, it gets so bad that people come in and say, oh no, you have to change the way you're doing your things. So we hope it doesn't come to that, but that would certainly move things in a hurry.
Bags of money also.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Caylin and Lisa, and for everyone sticking around and everyone who's watching. We really, round of applause for a very informative, concise, and well presented presentations. So the conversation is ongoing. We'll stay in contact with you all, and we're building this bridge between these different groups to and these different kind of efforts to support our collective power as we're addressing these shared struggles as the pressure continues from drought, climate change, all these things. So we just really appreciate y'all, and enjoy your afternoon. We'll see you at the next Tricky Topics meeting.